I'm going to say welcome to everyone. Uh, Good evening. Uh, hope everything's going well with you, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some of these things with you on this highly controversial topic of carbon dioxide and climate change. Okay, well, let's get started. So, first, an introduction. The goal of this presentation is discussion and dialogue. So, kind of the format that we have going here is I'm going to do a presentation for approximately the first hour, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A and comments and questions that you might have. Realize that there's a lot of controversy around this topic, and it'll be a good time just to discuss those things. Um, First, just at the outset, the views that I'm presenting here this evening are my own. What I share is not the perspective, obviously, as you will see, of mainstream media, nor the perspective of many government organizations. My views do differ a little from the official position of Reasons to Believe. So Reasons to Believe holds that climate change is a result of a combination of natural causes and significant effects of human activity, especially carbon dioxide emissions. My perspective leans more toward natural causes and that human activity is less of a factor than is generally claimed or assumed by all of the above. A little bit of my background for those that may not know me very well. I going way back, obviously, a BA, a Bachelor of Arts in Geography, including a course in climatology. So I've been actually keenly observant of climate and climate patterns most of my adult life. I've had a lifelong interest in what happens on planet Earth, and hearing all of the claims about the alarmist claims and so on, and having doubts about those claims, I began to investigate extensively over at least the last couple of years. So some important questions, and we can come back to these later in the next hour, but some things to think about. Has climate on Earth changed in recent years? Are humans in danger of going extinct because of climate change? You hear a lot about this on the various media outlets these days. What are we being told is constantly as the cause of climate change and global warming? The answer there is obviously carbon dioxide. Is the science settled about carbon dioxide and climate change or not? So we're investigating that. Are there other possible causes of climate change and global warming than CO2? And have CO2 levels changed in the past 150 years or more? We will see the answer to that is yes. And are there any benefits to increased levels of atmospheric CO2? And this is where I'm going to be ending the presentation this evening. I think you'll be surprised, maybe even amazed at benefits that virtually nobody even mentions, but we'll get into that a little later. So climate fluctuations over the past 3,500 years or so. Has climate changed over that period? We're going to see that it has fluctuated. So what is the mechanism? How do scientists know what climate was like over the past 3,500 years? And I mean, I could spend a lot of time going into this, but just very briefly, tree rings. Trees, for example, tend to grow better when temperatures are warmer. Of course, moisture factors into that as well, but tree rings do give an indication of past climate. Ice cores also, and I did a presentation a couple of years ago on the Antarctic ice sheet and global warming and all of that. And there's a ratio of oxygen 16 to oxygen 18, which I'm not going to go into right now, but that ratio changes given the temperature of the oceans. And so we're able to tell something of what the climate and the ocean temperatures were like going back up to 800,000 years. More recently, crop and tithe records in monasteries, particularly in Europe. We're going to see a video that will talk about that a little bit. Varves, if you're not familiar with what varves are, they're the sediments at the bottom of lakes. Some other scenarios as well, but in the summer you get leaf litter and pollens and all of that settling down to the bottom. Then in the wintertime, you get like a little dark layer where basically sediments in the water settle, and then you start it over year after year. And we can tell, or scientists can tell, what pollen levels were like, you know, what plants were growing in the vicinity of the lake and that kind of thing. How do we know what carbon dioxide levels were like? So ice cores, again, in Antarctica, going back, as I said, at least 800,000 years. Tiny bubbles of air are trapped in ice cores from not only Antarctica, but glaciers, ice fields, Greenland, Antarctica. And those tiny little bubbles of air can be analyzed to reveal the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the time. And of course, the layers give us how many years back each layer was. So here's a graph of atmospheric carbon dioxide over the past 40,000 years. Couple of things to note. So around between 20 and 15,000 years ago, carbon dioxide levels reached their lowest level in at least recently recorded history. So this would be near the end of the last ice age before we get into the interglacial period, and got down as low as about 180 parts per million. Remember that number, that's significant. It's going to show up in a video that we're going to look at. But basically, plant life will start dying out if carbon dioxide levels drop below 150 parts per million. Then it rose, so around 12,000 years ago, which would be the beginning of the current interglacial period, rose just a little above 250 parts per million. And then if you look right at the very right-hand side of the graph, you see a dramatic rise in carbon dioxide levels. And then little notations there indicating the level in the year 1900, 1950, and the year 2000. So here's another graph for the last 1,000 years. And based on 3 different sites in Antarctica. So that gives you the red line, the blue line, and the black line. As you can see, until we get to roughly 1880, carbon dioxide levels were all below 290 parts per million. And then about 1880, you see a dramatic rise in carbon dioxide levels. And so there's a number of causes, and it's not fully understood, obviously. Some of it, so oceans, as they warm, will release more carbon dioxide. There's many, many factors. Some of it, obviously, is going to be human activity that has generated an increase in carbon dioxide. Now, the big question is, what is the impact of that on global temperatures? And that's where we're going to look at here very shortly. So just a bit of a summary so far. No one denies that CO2 levels have risen and continue to rise. And today they've just recently passed 420 parts per million. As I said, the cause of rising CO2 levels is unclear. Some comes from man-made emissions, others from other natural processes. And scientists have been unable to determine exactly the origin of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You know, how much comes from one source, how much comes from another. Um, so CO2 levels obviously are rising. No one's denying that. Should we be concerned? Let's see what the evidence suggests. So looking back at history, there are some different periods of warmer and cooler periods in over, let's say, the last 3,500 to 3,000 years. And I've kind of outlined them here and a little bit more in the next slide as well. So between 3000 BC and 1500 BC, there is a period known as the Minoan warm period. And keep in mind that CO2 levels were all under 290 parts per million. Then there was a cooler period from 1500 to about 250 BC. Then there was the Roman warm period, which included the time when Christ walked on the earth, and from about 250 BC to 400 AD. And every indication is that temperatures were warmer then, at that time, than today. Then there was the Dark Ages cold period from 500 AD to 950 AD. And this was a time primarily in Europe, because that's where we have the best records, but a time of disease, of famine, of poor crops, all due to colder temperatures. Seems like life thrives and everybody does better when things are warmer than when they are colder. Then there was the medieval warm period, 950 to 1250 AD. And a couple of interesting details on that. Greenland had much green vegetation. That's why it was called Greenland during this time of Viking expansion. Just another note on that, some explorer, I forget who now, went back around 1300 to 1350 AD, and nobody was in Greenland. 100 years, 150 years before, there was a vibrant population there, and sheep ranchers and all kinds of things like that. But then Greenland got too cold to support life, and when somebody took a boat and checked, there wasn't anybody left on Greenland because things were getting colder. So in Antarctica, just a recent article I read had populations of elephant seals that moved north after this time, as it was too cold for them then, like after 1250 and through to today. And they know this because they found on the shorelines that weren't covered with glaciers, there are the remains of elephant seals, and they've done carbon dating on the bones and the remains of these elephant seals, and found that they were there right from the Roman warm period all the way through to the medieval warm period. But then because it got too cold there, and so they have left to take up islands away from Antarctica, and I think also into the southern tip of South America and places like that. So following the medieval warm period, there's the Little Ice Age from 1300 to 1860. This was again mostly in Europe, but although there are records, even in India and other places around the world. Colder winters, advancing glaciers in Europe again, crop failures, and a lot of emigration to North America, of which your family and mine may be a part. It certainly was in my case. My relatives came over later than 1860, but a lot of people came over during that time because they were trying to get away from the poor conditions in Europe at the time. So then we get into the last 150 years or so, So 1880, and still we're below 290 parts per million until about 1880. So we had a period that was warmer than today, clear through to about 1950. So the dirty 30s were included in this, and I've read reports and listened to reports of many cities, like dozens and dozens of cities across Canada and the US that showed way more summer days reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit than today. So there are many indications that the temperatures were much warmer up between 1880 and 1950 than today. Interesting, just a little comment. I was coming home from work and listening to the radio, and they're commenting that, oh, what was the year? 1890, I think. On this date, temperature was 30 degrees Celsius, and where they're saying we're a long ways from reaching that record today. So just to comment on one day, and one day doesn't prove anything, obviously, but when you have 40 or 50 or 20 or 30 days over 100, whereas today you're getting maybe 2 or 3, is an indication that the weather was much warmer, mainly across the United States and Canada for these records, but much warmer than today. Then we get into the 1950s to the 1980s, which were cooler than today. And you may recall, if you were around at that time, warnings of a coming ice age, National Geographic and many other scientists saying that we're on the brink of the next ice age and things are getting colder. Then from 1980 to 2000, we had a steady warming trend. And I observed it, I'm sure you observed it, winter's getting more mild, and generally things were getting warmer. And since, as we already saw, CO2 was rising, there were scientists and others who concluded or even insist that there's a correlation. Although we're going to see in a video here in a little bit that there is virtually no significant correlation between CO2 levels on Earth and temperatures. But there are some who insisted then and continue to insist that there is a correlation, as we'll see here shortly. So, and then we have 2000 to 220, which is the last 20 years. Global temperatures have basically been steady. As I indicated, they rose from about 1980 to 2000. And I recognize there's a lot of dispute and a lot of claims of the hottest January, the hottest February, the hottest year of the last 3 or whatever. I believe a lot of those claims are bogus and based on predictions of climate models rather than actual temperatures. But the best understanding I have is that global temperatures have been steady and even slightly lowering in recent years, but still warmer than in, let's say, 1980, but not continuing to rise. So CO2 levels have been going up. As I said, well, just in the last few months, they reached 420 parts per million. And as we're well aware, leading many alarmists to panic. All right. So what seems to be driving the current hysteria about climate change? Two big factors are, well, the main factor is computer climate models, and there are two aspects of this. The first is Michael E. Mann and his hockey stick graph. Now, you can Google it. I didn't pull up a copy of it, but if you Google Michael E. Mann hockey stick, you will see many representations of the graph that he first developed. Basically, the idea is that climate has been pretty flat for at least the last 1,000 years, which we see isn't exactly accurate from what I've just been sharing with you. And then, like a hockey stick, if you lay it, on the floor with the blade sticking up, there's a sudden rise, and that rise basically coincides on this graph with CO2 levels. So that's the claim, is that Earth is warmed, it's been flat for 1,000 years, and then it's rising dramatically, and it's going to continue to rise as temperatures are going to rise as atmospheric CO2 levels rise. The other aspect of this is reliance of the IPCC, and in case you not sure what that is, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN, the World Health Organization, which, by the way, has a major division devoted to controlling climate change, and many others base their predictions of weather on computer models rather than actual temperature data. And we'll see shortly why there's problems with that. Just a note about the IPCC's claims. They claim that climate science reports are peer-reviewed, but there are many scientists, and I've got somewhere in my information a list of 46 scientists who were part of that peer review process that essentially said that the process is broken. The peer review process is broken, it's a sham. And that the IPCC issues summary reports even before the peer review responses are in. And that at least these 46 scientists that were consulted say there is no alarmist information, even in the initial report. So there's two aspects of their reports. There's the main climate reports themselves that the IPCC puts out, and then there's the summary reports. And the summary reports, which is released to governments and the public and media and so on, are far more alarmist in their content and their rhetoric than what is actually found in the full IPCC climate report. So there's a cause for concern here, and we'll get into that a little bit more shortly. Okay, is there a problem with Michael E. Mann's hockey stick graph on climate change? My belief is absolutely yes. As I already explained, the graph basically shows flat temperatures until CO2 starts to rise. And there's just no evidence to say that there's a correlation between global temperatures on Earth and CO2 and CO2 levels. So we're going to go to a video segment now. Let me see, it might take me a minute to get here. I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to try to get to the video because we're not going to watch the whole thing. I want to start at 12 minutes and 7 seconds and go to 17 minutes and 18 seconds, just a segment. The whole video is excellent. And I was going to suggest that if you have your phone, take a picture of this or email me later and I can send you these links. This whole video, historian looks at climate change, is excellent. But for the sake of time, we're only going to look at a short segment of this video. So.
Now, speaking of the medieval warm period, again, as a historian, the moment I saw Michael Mann's infamous hockey stick, I said, hey, what happened to the Middle Ages? I've known ever since I was just a small historian, and by the way, if being a historian is a shame, it's a family shame, because my mother was a historian and so was my grandfather. So I've known since I was quite young that the Middle Ages was characterized by warmth, by abundant harvests, and by the kind of cultural and geopolitical conditions that led to a flowering of arts and other institutions. That's when the great cathedrals were built. That's when universities were invented. that's when hospitals appeared. And it's also earlier in that period when the Vikings made their voyages of discovery, which I grant you were a mixed blessing to the people they discovered and then stole their stuff and burned down their villages. But it also got them to Iceland and Greenland before falling temperatures wiped out the settlements in the latter. And there's more here. You see, when it became cold in the 14th century, as the medieval warm period started giving way to the Little Ice Age, and this cooling is captured in the paintings of Peter Bruegel the Elder and a number of other artists, the crops failed, the Black Death came, and it was a disaster. So again, I looked at Michael Mann's hockey stick and I said, where's the medieval warm period and why do we think warming is bad? On which subject? A few years ago when I was making The Environment a True Story, I had the good fortune to be able to interview Princeton University physicist Will Happer, who is well known for his path-breaking work in atmospheric science and for his dissent from global warming orthodoxy. I discovered that in addition to being a distinguished scientist, he also knows a lot about the historical evidence for the medieval warm period. He talked about the records of tithing to monasteries, which give you ideas of where crops were being grown and in what quantities. He talked about where tree lines were in the Middle Ages versus where they were centuries later. And in both cases, it was clear that warmth meant that plants grew better, including food crops. Which means, whatever you think of crop failure, there's really no question of the medieval warm period having existed. And, as a historian, I just know it's not even controversial. Books on art history talk about the medieval warm period. Just as it's essentially uncontroversial that the Dark Ages were colder, and it's one reason they were dark. Or that before that, there was a Roman warm period. There was also a Minoan warm period. There was a Holocene climate optimum. And then if you go back into the Pleistocene and you look at the glaciations, you see a cycle of brief warm periods, which are nice, and long cold ones that aren't. So yes, history tells us that temperatures fluctuate, and it tells us, yes, they have been rising since Victorian times. But again, a historian says, well, of course they have. It's a natural rebound from the Little Ice Age. It's part of a cycle of these coolings and warmings, and so it's illogical to attribute all the warming since 1860 or 1970 to human influence, as though the Thames would probably still be freezing if it weren't for that wretched Henry Ford. And here's another historically based question about climate change. Whenever I hear people saying, we're seeing levels of atmospheric CO2 unmatched in the last 2.5 million years, my inclination is to say, okay, well, what happened last time they were at this level? You're telling me it's going to lead to runaway warming, but I look back and I see that last time it happened, the warm and lush Pliocene abruptly gave way to the chilly and barren Pleistocene, a prolonged ice age that we're actually still in, because the definition of an ice age is significant polar ice. Fortunately, we're in one of those hospitable interglacials called the Holocene. Though, again, judging by past patterns, the Holocene is winding down, not up. And if it is, we're in a world of hurt that we can't fix by spraying CO2 around because it's just not the control knob on the global thermometer. The historical record makes that abundantly clear. Now, as a historian, I employ my expertise to caution you here that reconstructions of temperature and atmospheric CO2 become increasingly speculative and unreliable as we go back. But this chart, which I used in my documentary, shows what we think temperature and CO2 might have been like going back essentially to the Cambrian explosion, the appearance of multicelled life on Earth. And let me tell you, no historian, no scientist, no intelligent lay voter would ever look at these lines and say, ah, yes, well, clearly the red one is driving the blue one. And yes, even if you're neither a historian nor a climate scientist, don't let anybody tell you you lack the qualifications to look at this chart and see the obvious. Now, I will concede one point here about the role of experts. If a question is purely technical, if it doesn't have political or social implications, and it really is settled, then I'm all in favor of deferring to them. If we want to know the 100th digit of pi, let's ask a mathematician or some high school kid who's memorized the thing. If If we need to know how far it is from Earth to Jupiter, let's ask an astronomer. But climate science is not in that category. It's a field that's wide open to debate, in which there is massive disagreement.
All right, and that's as far as I want to go with that presentation. John Robinson is a Canadian, I believe. He posts his videos out of somewhere in Ontario. The name escapes me at the moment, but it's Climate Discussion Nexus is his website. And there's a lot of videos, a lot of articles and information there. Well worth checking out. So this is a screen that I was looking at. We just looked at that. So recent analysis of the computer climate model shows flaws in the ability to predict temperature trends. Two papers are mentioned here: Environmental Research Letter by McKittrick and Christie, and another one by Mitchell et al. Discuss predictions of temperature trends. So basically, they've taken both the currently used computer models by the IPCC and others, and also the new one that's going to be implemented in the year 2022, and their analysis by looking, so they're running it backwards. They're looking at the last 40 years, and by doing so, they say that the computer models are exaggerating the warming impact of CO2 emissions by an average of 5 times. And so basically the predictions are 5 times more than what is actually happening. The Canadian version of the current computer climate model overstates global warming by about 7 times. So makes you think, well, what's going on here? And my best grasp is that these computer models aren't accurate. Too much has been factored into the effect of CO2. Okay, so if global temperatures have leveled off since the year 2000, why are we frequently told that recent years are the warmest ever? A couple of factors in this. One is something called the heat island effect. And basically, a lot of weather stations were outside of various cities, say 20, 40 years ago, whatever. The cities have expanded and grown, but the weather stations haven't moved. And I know living in Calgary, we're often several degrees warmer even than Airdrie, which is just a few miles or a few kilometers to the north. And this city heat island effect is found, like, it's widespread. There was even this is way back now, but a picture of a weather station that had one time been out in the country, and it was now sitting right beside a paved road, and there was a building on just away from the easement, and there was an air conditioning unit in the window blowing warm air towards the weather station. So this is an example of the heat island effect, why some temperatures are skewed in terms of what they're reporting today. And then the discrepancy that we already talked about regarding computer models. Now, I say what I'm going to show you next is actually quite disturbing. As I was reviewing everything, I think I'm going to hold off on presenting this video, but I'll give you a brief summary. So this video is in 2 parts. The first part is 9 minutes. The second part is 12 minutes. I was going to just look at the 12-minute segment, but I think that's going to take up way too much time. But So Tony Heller is somebody that I look at a lot, and I mean, he's very blunt, and sometimes, um, he calls fraud and people liars and stuff like that. But he has some really good information. So he has, over the years, archived thousands of newspapers and other articles, and spends a lot of time reviewing and then sharing what has been recorded compared to what is being presented by different organizations, including NASA and NOAA. NOAA is National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And what he points out is that the data is being altered deliberately. So there are graphs, and he shows a number of them from different cities in Iceland, where it shows warming temperatures in Iceland in the 1940s. Well, longer than that, but it peaked in the 1940s, and then it cooled off. And he actually shows some emails and discussions between one of these climate science leaders at either NASA or NOAA, I think it was NOAA, and a senator in the US who basically said the records have been altered. They went to the Icelandic government, climate department, whatever that is, and says, there are new graphs. Are you in agreement with the changes, that the records in the 1940s were inaccurate? And they said no. And so there's a lot of investigation, but the email said, going back and forth among climate scientists in something called Climate Gate, said they were actually discussing, how do we get rid of the 1940s peak in temperatures so that the hockey stick graph and other graphs don't show warming until CO2 levels have gotten much higher than they were. I found this quite disturbing, actually. I would encourage you to check that out. So Tony Heller, Climate Collusion and Fraud, Parts 1 and 2. At this point, I'd like to add another slide that I did not include in the original presentation. Tony Heller again reports some tampering by NASA and NOAA on the US temperature records, and it's rather concerning. Same scenario as what took place in Iceland, but for the continental US. As far as I know at this point, temperature records across Canada have not been altered, but it would be interesting to do some comparisons or do some checks with, let's say, newspaper articles. Even Calgary or something could look at temperatures on the Canadian site and compare them with recorded temperatures, let's say, in the Calgary Herald or other newspapers. And certainly the same would be true for other cities across the US. Okay, big question. Is the Earth on the brink of irreversible disaster leading to an extinction level catastrophe? So virtually every Western government that I'm aware of, including the Canadian government and every province in Canada, has bought into the agenda that everyone needs to curb CO2 emissions. In 2009, Barack Obama worked with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to declare that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, so that it could be controlled. That greenhouse gases, and this is a quote from Barack Obama, greenhouse gases endanger both the public health and the public welfare of current and future generations. So the whole climate thing has become very much a political issue as well as an alarmist issue on many fronts, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. This effort to limit or reduce carbon dioxide levels is driving the US Democrats because Barack Obama first got this going and they're following in the agenda that he set. The UN, the World Health Organization, as you're well aware, I'm sure, the Canadian Liberal government under Justin Trudeau, and many others to control CO2 emissions at all costs. And the cost to Alberta, to Canada, and much of the world is literally in the trillions of dollars in the efforts to control, even stop all CO2 emissions. Okay, so some authors are trying to mitigate this rhetoric, and so three that are noteworthy here that I include: Hugh Ross, who's the president of Reasons to Believe, recently wrote a book, Weathering Climate Change. It's a very good book. I don't agree with everything that Hugh has said, as I indicated in my first slide, but he does talk about how can we mitigate the effects of climate change and not cripple the world's economy and bring, you know, all kinds of pain to poorer nations and stuff like that. So his is a good book. It's a very good read. Another one is Bjorn Lomborg. Recently wrote a book, and I have a copy that I purchased a little bit ago titled False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillion, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. And then another one, Michael Schellenberger, his recent book, Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. And Michael Schellenberger recently apologized for misleading so many, as he had formerly championed environmentalism causes in the past. And yeah, he talks about, after his apology, of all the pushback by other environmentalists and things like that. But that's his understanding. So the overall theme of these books and a lot of others, even if climate change is real due to CO2 emissions or other causes, don't panic, adapt. Fear-driven panic is unnecessary and is costing us trillions. As all life has adapted very well to different levels of CO2 and even warmer or colder weather in the past, and we're not going to go extinct because of this. Okay, what are organizations like the UN, the World Health Organization, the IPCC, and others saying, the EPA and others? And I'm sure you're familiar with these claims. If CO2 continues to rise, there's going to be more frequent and more severe weather. There's going to be extensive drought and famine. Greenland and Antarctica ice sheets will melt away, drowning coastlines everywhere. Whole countries like the Maldives will drown. People won't be able to survive the extreme heat, and climate migration will devastate countries all around the world. Coral reefs can't adapt and are all going to collapse. Hurricanes and forest fires will increase in number and intensity. And any anomaly in any remote place proves CO2 is going to kill us all. And they also claim that climate change skeptics, and I guess I would fall in that category, are terrorists and should be imprisoned. There are the leaders of the UN and the World Health Organization in particular who are saying that climate change skeptics are terrorists. Now, there are those who have countered and said, well, actually, you're terrorists because you're trying to scare, or you are scaring our young people, our children and young adults and so on, youth and so on, by your invalid information and your agenda and so on. But anyway, we can discuss that later. So are the alarmist claims realistic? So historically, forest fires were often much larger and more frequent from 1900 to 1950 than today. Now, granted, today we have better tools to control outbreaks of forest fires and so on, but the graph is staggering, actually. It would be like 4 to 5 times or more the number and the extent of forest fires in that time period than today. And even though you keep hearing the word unprecedented in the news and so on, but historically, there's no way that it's unprecedented. There's been lots of alarmist claims that polar bears are going to die out. The reality is they're thriving all across the Arctic. Their numbers are up. They're doing very well. Okay, hurricanes today are less severe and less frequent than 30 years ago, despite the claims. Even the recent ones of recent hurricanes that hit Louisiana here within the last few weeks. And there's at least 2 or 3 other examples way back, like before 1960, of 2 hurricanes hitting areas like that back to back, within a week kind of thing. So again, the claim of unprecedented is not unprecedented. There are fewer droughts and famines today than in recent decades, and that's a fact. The total ice mass index in Greenland and Antarctica is increasing, despite the claims that Greenland and Antarctica are going to melt away. That's not the case. And Denmark, for example, they monitor Greenland's total ice mass index, and it's increasing, year after year in the total amount of ice that exists there. Antarctica and Greenland have had record cold winter temperatures in recent years, even though that's not very often reported, if at all, and the alarmists won't mention it because it doesn't really support their agenda. And coral reefs that were going through cycles and, were kind of dying back in some areas have totally recovered and are thriving and adapting to warmer ocean temperatures. So just think back, if you were around in the 1970s, what were the claims like and what was happening? I remember, I lived in Saskatoon during some of that time, and the winters were bitterly cold, and true enough, they're milder today. But the alarmists were saying at that time, including National Geographic and others, that we're headed for the next ice age. And there was also lots of concern that the Earth was no longer going to be able to provide enough food for all the people that were alive, and even talks of population control and stuff like that. That's not happening anymore for good reason, and we'll see that shortly. So, failed climate catastrophe predictions since 1980. I see we're getting a little late on time. So let me skip this video as well. But this is definitely an interesting one worth looking at. It's kind of entertaining. It's 11 minutes long, but by Climate Discussion Nexus, titled False Prophets of Climate Doom. Basically what they do is they look at all the failed predictions of climate alarmists, like the Arctic Ocean is going to melt away by 2013, and totally there isn't going to be any ice in the Arctic Ocean. We're all going to die, and things like that. There's a whole bunch of climate predictions that have not come to pass, and those dates have already passed. So I think you'd find it interesting and entertaining to check that out on your own. And like I said, you could either take a screenshot or take a picture of the screen, or email me afterwards say, I'd like to copy those links, and I'll put them together, and I can send you the links that I've included in this presentation. So, okay, to recap then, regarding carbon dioxide and temperature trends over the last 150 years. CO2 levels have risen steadily from 280 to about 420 parts per million. Temperature trends, well, we've been through that, but 1880 to 1950, they were warmer than today. Then there was a 30-year cooling period, and then 20-year warming period, and then things have kind of leveled off. Now, I'm not really in this presentation getting into some of the natural causes, but a couple of factors. One is that right now, and especially in the 1980s to the year 2000, there were fewer volcanic eruptions, and the aerosols, all the ash and so on, spewing into the atmosphere, which reflects sunlight. And so there are fewer of those, and so there has been more warming of the surface of the earth and the atmosphere because of this. And then there's fluctuations in solar output, which in my presentation and I've not prepared a whole lot of it yet, but what I'm planning to touch on in November in our meeting, we'll explore the solar input in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I want to shift gears here and look at the significance of increased CO2. First of all, carbon dioxide is essential for life. We're going to see this in a very significant little video clip in a minute. If CO2 levels were to drop below 150 parts per million, all plant life would die, and ultimately all animal life would die as well. So one factor in all of this, when CO2 levels are lower, pores called stomatal pores on the leaves of all plants, virtually. When CO2 levels are lower, those pores are more open, and therefore they transpire more moisture along with the input of carbon dioxide and release of oxygen and those kinds of things. And so as CO2 levels go up, those openings get smaller because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, and this improves the water use efficiency of these plants. CO2 is a great benefit, and many aquarium owners, and our son, Jeremy, has about 6 aquariums, and he pumps CO2, especially into the biggest one, so that the water plants will grow better. Many greenhouse operators will boost CO2 levels from 2 to 4 times at current atmospheric levels to 800 to 1600 parts per million to boost productivity and yield. And you'll recall that alarmists in the past have said the world can't produce enough food. There hasn't been a problem in this area since CO2 levels have risen dramatically. Now, certainly farming practices have gotten better in a lot of places and so on, but the last 20 years have been wonderfully productive around the world, and essentially because of increased carbon dioxide levels. And there's some speculation that we probably need even more CO2 in the atmosphere by the year 2020 to stave off food supply shortages in the future. Okay, conversations that matter. This is a portion. Dr. Patrick Moore, he was a co-founder of Greenpeace, and he was involved in stopping atom bomb testing and the slaughter of whales and some things like that. But then Greenpeace moved in some directions that he wasn't comfortable with, and basically started saying that humans are the problem, that humans are ruining the world, and things like that. So he parted company with them when that happened. But he continues to especially promote carbon dioxide and so on. So I wanted to look at another video clip, just 5.5 minutes. I think you'll find this fascinating.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Patrick Moore. We pick it up now as he continues to share his opinions on GMOs, climate, the environment, and NGOs that he says have little regard for the truth, but are rather peddling an agenda. Freeman Dyson told me, he said, well, just look around the world right now, it's greener. And yet then when I see that happen, like...
That's a proven fact.
Yeah, well, the reforestation or the regrowth in the Amazon has been phenomenal. Then I read comments in the New York Times like, well, it's ridiculous that this should have happened in the first place. You can't be like replanting or recovering from what was an environmental disaster by putting more carbon into the atmosphere. It was as though you cannot have good news. I find it quite remarkable. I get to the point where like the voices are so loud that I'm going, okay, how do I find where there actually is truth?
Well, where there's truth is that carbon is the basis of all life on Earth. Mm-hmm. And where there's truth is that carbon dioxide is the source of that carbon for all life on Earth. And it's also true that for the last 600 million years, of which we have a reasonable record, CO2 has been declining in the global atmosphere to the point where at the peak of the last glaciation, when the oceans absorb more CO2 than they do when they're warm, it was cold, CO2 dropped to 180 parts per million.
Yeah.
And that is only 30 parts per million above the death of plants. And it is surmised because there's an ash layer associated with these peaks in cold during the glaciations.
It's only 30 parts per million above the death of plants?
Yes, and it's very clear from my paper that I've just published that if we had not intervened by putting the balance back into the carbon cycle, which was out of balance, it's a really interesting story because it's life itself that has sucked the CO2 out of the atmosphere over the millennia and put it into fossil fuels, but that's a very minor part of it. Mm-hmm. The big part of it is what's called carbonaceous rocks, limestone, chalk, and marble. And those are the remains of shells of marine calcifying organisms. And the calcium carbonate is what those shells are made out of. Mm-hmm. The carbon in the calcium carbonate is from CO2 that the oceans absorbed from the atmosphere. And that is what we're fracking for oil and gas, are those marine deposits of the shells of coccolithophores, which are minute phytoplankton that learned how to build. Many marine organisms, started 500 million years ago, many marine organisms learned how to control calcification. Mm-hmm. Biomineralization is the general term for it. Our bones, for example, are a case of biomineralization. But we did it for our skeletal structure, so we could stand up. Mm-hmm. The reason marine organisms did it was to basically build an armor plating around themselves, like clams and mussels and coral reefs and crabs. All of these are calcareous. And the calcium comes from the seawater. The carbonate comes from the air and is dissolved in the water. And so these huge deposits of shale are actually calcium carbonate. They are the shells of those plankton. The oil and gas is the organic matter of the living plankton that died and fell on the bottom of the ocean. But 100 million billion tons of carbonaceous rock represent carbon dioxide pulled out of the atmosphere. And because the Earth has cooled over the millennia, nature is no longer putting CO2 into the atmosphere to offset this. So the curves are there to look at on the internet. You can see it. CO2 has been declining to where it is getting close to the end of plant life. And another 1.8 million years, if you just take that line and draw it straight down, another 1.8 million years, life would begin to die on planet Earth for lack of CO2.
Not because of an excess.
There is no such thing as an excess of CO2 under any real-world circumstance.
Well, the message out there is pretty clear that there is such a thing.
No, there isn't. Because it's proven fact, for example, that greenhouse growers they actually buy CO2 in bottles.
Well, I know, they pump it in.
They pump it in to get it up to 1,000 parts per million. The optimum CO2 level for plant growth, which, when you think about it, is the basis of all the animal life on Earth, every insect, every vertebrate, every invertebrate, all the things that are not plants depend on the plants for their existence. The sugars the plants produce through photosynthesis are the energy supply for the whole world. What are those sugars made out of? Water and carbon dioxide. Those are and when you burn fossil fuels, which are the result of photosynthesis, what do you get? Water and carbon dioxide and some contaminants, which we know how to clean. But that's what basically comes out of the tailpipe, is water and CO2. Plants take those two things and turn them into glucose, sugar, and everything else goes from there.
Couple of other interesting aspects of this. Warm weather is good for many reasons. There was a recent study out of Finland that with recent warmer weather, birds have more eggs and more offspring, and overall life does better with warmer conditions than cold. Rather than being a cause for panic and alarm and mental health issues and an increase in the number of suicides and so on because of all of the scare tactics around carbon dioxide, we need to realize that CO2 is actually a huge benefit to life, and it's not leading us to extinction, but to an increase in benefits. Okay, so I guess just have a few more slides here. A great website is co2science.org. On that website, if you go there, there are a series of 5 videos. I'm just going to play the introductory video because it kind of covers the whole scope, and then he gets into more detail. And actually, each of these others is longer than the introduction.
Hello, I'm Dr. Craig Idso, Chairman of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. In recent years, governments and elected officials at all levels have proposed or enacted regulations and laws designed to restrict the use of fossil fuels via tax, caps, or fiat limits on CO2 emissions. Such efforts are based upon the notion that CO2 emissions are polluting the atmosphere and causing dangerous global warming. However, nothing could be further from the truth. CO2 emissions and fossil fuel use have actually enhanced life and improved the standard of living, and will continue to do so as more fossil fuels are used. Nevertheless, forces opposing fossil fuel use have grown in both number and political power. Their efforts enabled President Obama's EPA to declare in late 2009 that CO2 emissions resulting from the combustion of carbon-based fossil fuels are a current threat to human health and welfare. This so-called endangerment finding, however, was not the result of rigorous scientific study and debate. EPA relied too heavily on flawed computer model projections of possible harms that might occur in the distant future. And in the process, they chose to ignore real-world observations that invalidated the conclusions reached from computer model projections. The EPA also failed to analyze and account for critical and very significant direct and indirect benefits to both humanity and the natural world that result from CO2 emissions and fossil energy use in reaching their endangerment finding. Benefits of which, if included, would likely have reversed their decision. We intend to bring these important facts to light in a new video series so as to build public support and political will to reverse the 2009 endangerment finding and other federal, state, or local established or emerging policies aimed at eliminating CO2 emissions and fossil fuel use. The title we have chosen for the series is The Greening of Planet Earth Confirmed. The new videos represent an addition and update to two prior works, The Greening of Planet Earth and The Greening of Planet Earth Continues, which were inspired and based upon two books, Carbon Dioxide, Friend or Foe, and Carbon Dioxide, Earth in Transition, that were authored by our organization's president in the 1980s. These seminal works examine the role that CO2 plays as one of nature's basic building blocks of life in the process of photosynthesis and the evolution of the Earth's biosphere. In the first video, evidence was presented to show how CO2 levels in the atmosphere, which at the time of the film were about 30% higher than in the pre-industrial era, had greatly enhanced the growth of trees and other plants. Results from controlled studies were further cited to predict how a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is expected to occur before the end of the present century, would increase crop yields, improve water use efficiency of most of the Earth's vegetation, and greatly enhance the productivity of forests. By the time of the second video, the controversy over the effects of increasing levels of carbon dioxide on nature and the fossil fuel combustion that contributes to it had continued to intensify. Despite solid evidence to the contrary, many were speculating that increasing CO2 levels would result in apocalyptic global warming and eventual environmental disaster. In The Greening of Planet Earth Continues, expert scientists asserted otherwise. CO2 is not a pollutant, but a nutrient to life on Earth that provides a multitude of benefits to humanity and the natural world. The video also explored other key facts about climate history and the problems with computer model simulations used to predict the impact of increasing CO2 levels on future climate. And it presented a vision for the future that was in stark contrast to the alarmist forecasts of climate catastrophe that permeated the day. Nearly 30 years have passed since the first greening video was produced, allowing more than enough time to properly evaluate the accuracy of the two opposing viewpoints surrounding the potential human and environmental impacts of rising CO2 and fossil fuel use. In our Greening of Planet Earth Confirmed video series, we offer just such an assessment, demonstrating that there is absolutely no observational evidence that provides any compelling support for the contention that there is something unusual, unnatural, or unprecedented about Earth's current warmth. There is no real-world data confirming that floods, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, or other extreme weather events are becoming either more frequent or more severe as a result of global warming. There is no indication that the total mass of Earth's polar ice sheets is on the verge of declining any faster than the proverbial snail's pace at which it has done so in the recent past. There is no evidence that sea levels are about to rise precipitously and inundate the world's coastal lowlands. Likewise, evidence is lacking in support of claims that searing heat waves are killing the poor and elderly and drying up precious farmland, that devastating diseases are spreading to regions previously considered immune to them, that migrating plants and animals will be unable to move to cooler locations fast enough to avoid extinction, that coral reefs will dissolve into oblivion as the oceans warm and turn acidic, or that anarchy will spread within and among nations as fighting erupts over dwindling water and food supplies. Additionally, our evaluation of existing data confirmed that it is undeniable that fossil energy initiated and continues to sustain the Industrial Revolution and the many human and environmental benefits that have emerged therefrom. Without adequate supplies of low-cost, centralized energy, few, if any, of the major technological and innovative advancements of the past 2 centuries that have spurred economic growth, reduced poverty, increased literacy, and enhanced and prolonged human life could have occurred. Without the increased CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use over the past 2 centuries, Earth's terrestrial biosphere would be nowhere near as vigorous or productive as it is today. Rather, it would be devoid of the growth-enhancing, water-saving, and stress alleviating benefits it has reaped in managed and unmanaged ecosystems from rising levels of atmospheric CO2 since the Industrial Revolution began. When considering and accounting for these and other positive improvements to humanity and the natural world, in conjunction with the absence of evidence of an impending climate catastrophe, it becomes scientifically and morally indefensible to demonize fossil fuel use and declare CO2 emissions a current or long-term threat to human health and welfare. The forces opposing CO2 emissions and fossil fuel use continue to grow in both number and political power. Our Greening of Planet Earth Confirmed video series provides the antidote to their nonsensical policy proposals. It provides a clear and powerful evaluation of the two opposing hypotheses predicting the impacts of rising CO2 and fossil fuel use on humanity and the natural world, which evaluation is sorely needed and warranted. The reality is that our world needs more, not less CO2 emissions and fossil fuel use to enhance the future human environment. I hope that you will join with us in our efforts to bring these critical facts to light and provide an impetus for building public support and political will to reverse the 2009 endangerment finding and other state or municipal level policies aimed at eliminating fossil fuel use. We need your help and your financial support. Thank you, and stay tuned for more to come.
Okay, so let me go to the next slide then. I just got maybe 2 or 3 slides left. Politics and money. I won't take a lot of time with this, but the alarmist propaganda and the green agenda are very much driven by politics and money. I already talked about Obama and his administration and the EPA declaring CO2 a pollutant, which Democrat Party in the US in particular continue to push that agenda. Funding for how CO2 is causing global warming is 33 to 1 compared with the funding that skeptics of climate change would get. So there's a lot of money going into CO2 research, and things like that. Billions of dollars annually go under different governments go to green initiatives such as solar and wind and others. Some big companies have earned billions of dollars overnight in CO2 cap and trade schemes. The UN, the IPCC, the World Health Organization, they're all pushing the alarmist agenda. And as I said, a major division of the World Health Organization is devoted to controlling man-made CO2 emissions, which they claim is devastating the planet and so on. Okay, something called cancel culture. There's a lot of effort. I'll just say this quickly. Basically, there's a lot of effort to suppress climate skeptics or climate change deniers, in quotes. There are those at the UN and the World Health Organization who openly suggest that climate change deniers should be imprisoned. And the opposite side would say we'd rather have debate than suppression. There are Democratic committees in the US that are devoted to suppressing the skeptic viewpoint, including pressure on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and other platforms. Okay, there's a lot of reasons to think that trying to speak out against the current agenda is hopeless, but there is some reason for hope. Briefly, the Conservative Party in our own country is seeking to strike a balance between controlling CO2 emissions and promoting oil and gas. Unlike the Liberal Party, which it would appear is seeking to eradicate the oil and gas industry. I've certainly been in conversation with leaders in our own provincial government and sending them different, what I think, relevant information that might alter the perspective on controlling CO2. It seems that they're not willing to look at changing their view on carbon dioxide at this point. Just a comment. I'm not pushing any party or agenda, but something I think that might be worth checking out if you're so inclined. I recently found out, like just 2 or 3 weeks ago, that the People's Party of Canada actually believes and promotes pretty much exactly what I've been saying in this presentation. So I prepared this long before I was aware of Maxime Bernier and his position. So it might be worthwhile to examine their platform to see if it's something that you'd be interested in supporting. Certainly, if they were to at least get one seat in, in the next election, and a significant percentage of the popular vote, then maybe people would start to look at this issue and say, hey, there's another way of looking at things. So, just kind of wrapping up then, I think we need to give thanks to God for carbon dioxide. And this may seem like really strange compared to everything that's being presented out there, but I don't believe God made a mistake in the way that he created the earth, and that we are about to cause our own extinction because of CO2 emissions. There have been some tremendous blessings, as I've already mentioned. And one, the graph of the decline in global poverty because of increased productivity and so on, we should be grateful to God for that. God created the earth to be inhabited. And certainly there's times when he has brought or allowed a drought and famine and pestilence, but we do well, I think, to give thanks to God for the benefits that are coming to our planet at this time in their history. So some great websites. Might want to take a picture of this or ask me for a copy of this slide later. ClinTel stands for Climate Intelligence. It's a European site. Friends of Science Society is based right here in Calgary, actually. Climate Discussion Nexus, we've seen a video by them. Tony Heller at realclimatescience.com. Dr. Patrick Moore has his own website, echosense.me. And then the extinctionclock.org has a record of past and present climate alarmist claims and all of the ones that have failed to this point in time, and a countdown to when predictions that are still future are going to fail. So in conclusion, there's too much reliance on the predictions of climate computer models, which, as we have seen, overestimate the impact of CO2 on global warming by 5 to 7 times. These erroneous predictions have led to extensive alarmist rhetoric and effort to control CO2 emissions, which is crippling the global economy and hindering the development of third world economies as well. The rise in atmospheric CO2 levels have greatly benefited all life on planet Earth, and in fact would bring even greater benefit if we could reach 1,000 parts per million. A warmer climate is a benefit to all, not a cause for alarm. Life generally thrives under warmer weather conditions, as has been borne out historically, and we need to learn to adapt to changing climate rather than cripple the global economy in our efforts to curtail CO2 emissions.